The morning sun broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, casting long shadows across the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, where Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood with absolute confidence, watching his aircrews prepare for what he believed would be another effortless victory in Japan's unstoppable march across the ocean. But within hours, that confidence would shatter into incomprehensible terror as American dive bombers screamed down from the clouds at angles Japanese engineers had calculated. Were aerodynamically suicidal, striking with a precision that defied every assumption the Imperial Navy had made about American capabilities, turning Japan's four elite carriers into floating infernos and proving that the weapon they thought impossible wasn't steel or explosives, but intelligence itself, the breaking of their sacred JN 25 naval code that had allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his carriers in the exact coordinates where they could ambush the ambushers. 6 months earlier, Japan had stood as the Pacific's undisputed master, their attack on Pearl Harbor having crippled America's battleship fleet, their Zero fighters dominating every engagement, their naval aviators considered the finest in the world, and in the wardrooms of the combined fleet, admirals like Isoroku Yamamoto and his subordinates spoke with the certainty of men who had never known defeat, their discussions filled with calculations about how long it would take to force America to negotiate peace, how their superior training and warrior spirit made them invincible, how the soft Americans lacked the discipline and technical sophistication to challenge Japanese naval aviation. In those confident months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese intelligence officers had examined every aspect of American capability and found it wanting. Their pilots were undertrained, their tactics predictable, their torpedo bombers slow and vulnerable, their dive bombers incapable of the near-vertical attacks that would be necessary to hit a maneuvering carrier, and most importantly, their cryptography experts had assured the Naval Command that JN 25, the fleet code that contained every operational order, every ship movement, every strategic intention, was mathematically unbreakable, a cipher so complex that even if the Americans captured codebooks, they could never decrypt messages fast enough to matter in the fluid chaos of naval warfare. But in a basement room in Pearl Harbor, a team of exhausted American crypt analysts led by men like Joseph Rockefort had been working 20-hour days for months, piecing together fragments of intercepted messages, building probability matrices, cross-referencing patterns, and slowly, agonizingly, they began to see through the fog. They couldn't read everything, but they could read enough, and when they intercepted references to AF as a target for a major operation in early June, Rockefort executed a brilliant deception, having Midway send an uncoded message about water supply problems, then waiting until Japanese intelligence, having intercepted it, sent a coded message reporting that AF had water issues, confirming what Nimitz desperately needed to know. The Japanese were coming to Midway, and he would know when and where. The American preparations were driven by desperation more than confidence. Nimitz was gambling everything on intelligence that his own superiors in Washington doubted, stripping every available carrier from across the Pacific, knowing that if Rockefort was wrong, if the codebreakers had misread the intercepts, he would lose not just a battle but potentially the entire Pacific theater. And on the carrier's Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, pilots like Wade McCluskey, Richard Best, and Max Leslie prepared for a mission that felt like a suicide run, checking and rechecking their SBD Dauntless dive bombers, these ungainly aircraft that the Japanese dismissed as inferior, not knowing that American pilots had been training relentlessly in a tactic the enemy believed was impossible. A near-vertical dive attack starting at 14,000 feet and plunging almost straight down at angles exceeding 70 degrees, the aircraft screaming toward the target at speeds that made the controls shake and the wings groan, requiring pilots to overcome every instinct for self-preservation, to hold the dive through the wall of anti-aircraft fire, to wait until the last possible second at just 1,500 feet before releasing their bombs and pulling up so hard that blood drained from their brains and darkness crept into the edges of their vision. Japanese naval architects had studied this tactic and concluded it was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. The structural stress would tear most aircraft apart, the G-forces during pullout would incapacitate pilots, and even if somehow executed, the extreme speed and angle made accurate bombing impossible. So when intelligence reports suggested Americans were practicing such attacks, they were dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda, the kind of desperate boasting that a losing nation might engage in to maintain morale. On June 3rd, the Japanese fleet approached Midway exactly as the codebreakers had predicted. Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cutting through the swells in a protective box formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. their flight decks crowded with the best naval aircraft in the world, and in the ready rooms, Japanese pilots joked and smoked, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, China, and the Dutch East Indies, men who had never been bested in combat, who regarded this operation as just another step in their inevitable conquest. While on the bridge, Nagumo reviewed his plan with satisfaction. Strike Midway's defenses, draw out the American fleet if it dared to appear, and destroy it with overwhelming force. The Americans knew they were coming, but what the Americans possessed was something Japan couldn't conceive of: perfect intelligence not just of the attack's timing but of its composition, its objectives, its approach vectors, everything extracted from decoded messages that Japanese officers continued to send, never imagining that every word was being read by the enemy in near real time, and this intelligence allowed Nimitz to position his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, outside the search pattern of Japanese reconnaissance planes, invisible and waiting like wolves in tall grass. Dawn on June 4th broke clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect Pacific morning that made men forget they were sailing toward death, and Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Island at 4:30 a.m., 108 aircraft roaring off the decks, while keeping another full strike force below decks armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared, a doctrine of flexibility that had served Japan well in every previous battle. But at 5:34 a.m., Midway's radar, that electronic eye that Japanese strategists had convinced themselves America couldn't effectively deploy or utilize in combat, detected the incoming raid at 93 miles, giving the island's defenders time to scramble every flyable aircraft and prepare for the onslaught, and this early warning, which shouldn't have been possible, was the first crack in Japan's edifice of assumptions. The Japanese strike hit Midway hard, setting fuel tanks ablaze and destroying buildings, but they hadn't suppressed the island's ability to fight, and the strike leader radioed back the dreaded message that a second attack was necessary, a decision that would ripple through the battle with catastrophic consequences because Nagumo, ever cautious, decided to rearm his reserve strike force, replacing anti-ship torpedoes with land attack bombs, and in the organized chaos of a carrier flight deck, this meant bringing aircraft up from the hangars, removing torpedoes, wheeling them to storage, bringing up bombs, attaching them to hardpoints, a process that would take nearly an hour, and it was during this vulnerable window, with his decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, with his air patrol scattered chasing American torpedo bombers that had attacked in desperate, uncoordinated waves, with his crews exhausted from continuous operations, that the impossible happened. Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return, the vast empty ocean revealing nothing, and he was minutes away from having to turn back when he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast, speeding to rejoin the fleet, and McCluskey made the combat decision that changed history. He followed that destroyer's wake, and at 10:22 a.m., he saw them, 4 Japanese carriers in formation below, their decks packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, and without waiting, without coordinating, understanding that this perfect moment might evaporate in seconds, he rolled his SBD Dauntless into the attack dive that Japanese experts had declared impossible. The first Japanese officers to see the American dive bombers didn't believe their eyes. Aircraft were plunging almost vertically out of the sun, at angles that shouldn't allow controlled flight, at speeds that should have torn their wings off, and the realization hit like ice water. The Americans had not only mastered this technique, they had perfected it, turned it into a weapon of devastating precision, and there was nothing the Japanese could do because their Zero fighters were at low altitude, still chasing the torpedo bombers, unable to climb fast enough to intercept, and their anti-aircraft guns couldn't train on targets coming almost straight down, and the commanders on the bridges could only watch in paralyzed horror as the SBDs screamed down like avenging angels. Richard Best put his 1,000-pound bomb directly into Akagi's flight deck near the amidship elevator at 10:26 a.m., and that single bomb, striking at the worst possible moment when the hangar was full of armed and fueled aircraft, when torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across the deck, set off a chain reaction of explosions that turned the fleet flagship into a floating hell, fire roaring through the hangar bays, explosions rippling through the hull, pilots trapped in ready rooms as flames consumed them, and within minutes, the carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was dying, her captain ordering abandon ship as fires raged beyond any possibility of control. Kaga took multiple hits almost simultaneously, bombs punching through her flight deck and detonating in the hangar among armed aircraft, creating an inferno so intense that steel buckled and melted. her crew fighting desperately to save her even as ammunition cooked off and explosions tore through her structure, while Soryu, attacked by Yorktown's dive bombers, suffered the same catastrophic fate, 3 bombs striking in rapid succession, turning her into a blazing wreck that would sink within hours, and in less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 elite carriers were burning wrecks, their proud crews dead or dying, their hundreds of aircraft destroyed, a naval catastrophe so sudden and complete that Japanese observers struggled to process what they were witnessing. On Hiryu, the only surviving carrier, her captain launched an immediate counterstrike that found and damaged Yorktown, proving Japanese courage and skill hadn't diminished. But even this victory was Pyrrhic because American dive bombers found Hiryu in the afternoon, and she too was struck with bombs that started uncontrollable fires, and by evening, all 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone, sunk or sinking, taking with them not just ships but the trained pilots, the experienced crews, the mechanics and armorers and deck officers that represented a decade of Japan's naval investment. Losses that could never be replaced. In the aftermath, as surviving Japanese officers gathered on cruisers and destroyers, making their way back toward home in stunned silence, they tried to understand what had happened, how their invincible fleet had been destroyed in a single morning, and slowly, through interrogation of rescued American pilots, through analysis of the attack patterns, through intelligence reports that arrived too late, the horrifying truth emerged. The Americans had known they were coming, had known where to position their carriers, had known the timing and composition of the Japanese force, which could only mean one impossible thing. Their code had been broken, the unbreakable Jan 25 cipher had been penetrated, and every message they'd sent, every operational order, every strategic communication had been read by the enemy, turning their own communications into weapons against them, and combined with the dive bombing capability they'd dismissed as impossible, America had transformed technological and tactical innovations into a devastating surprise that negated every Japanese advantage. The weapon Japan thought was impossible wasn't a new type of bomb or torpedo, wasn't some revolutionary aircraft design, but something more profound. It was intelligence weaponized into perfect ambush. It was human courage pushed beyond theoretical limits. It was desperation focused into precision. It was the integration of technology, tactics, and information in ways that Japan's rigid doctrine couldn't anticipate. And as Yamamoto received the reports aboard his battleship, far behind the action, he understood immediately that Midway wasn't just a defeat. It was the end of Japan's offensive capability, the turning point where America's industrial power and innovative spirit began to overwhelm Japanese fighting spirit and tactical excellence. The admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had warned his government that they had awakened a sleeping giant, stood on the bridge of Yamato watching the smoke columns rise from the horizon where his carriers were dying, and he felt the weight of prophecy fulfilled. He had given Japan 6 months of victories, exactly as he had predicted, but now those 6 months were ending, and the giant was indeed awake, armed not just with industrial might but with an intelligence apparatus that could read Japan's most secret communications, with pilots trained to execute maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom, with commanders willing to gamble everything on the word of crypt analysts working in basement rooms thousands of miles away. And Yamamoto knew, even if his subordinates didn't yet, that the war was already lost, that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome an enemy that could predict your moves before you made them, that could turn your own assumptions into weapons against you, that could achieve the impossible while you remained trapped in the possible. In Tokyo, when the news finally reached Imperial headquarters days later after censors had tried desperately to soften the blow, there was disbelief, then rage, then a terrible silence as staff officers calculated what 4 carriers meant. Not just the ships themselves but the 250 aircraft lost, the 3,000 skilled personnel killed, the irreplaceable veterans who had trained for years, the maintenance crews who understood the temperamental engines, the armorers who could load a Kate torpedo bomber in darkness and rough seas, all gone, vaporized in 6 minutes of American dive bombing that wasn't supposed to be possible, and the questions began. How did the Americans know where to find the fleet? How did they position their carriers so perfectly? How did their pilots achieve bombing accuracy that Japanese experts had calculated was impossible? And slowly, reluctantly, the intelligence officers began to suspect what the operational commanders didn't want to believe, that their codes were compromised, that the enemy was reading their mail, that every confident message sent by radio was potentially giving away their plans. But even this realization came too late because the habits of communication were too ingrained, the belief in Japanese cryptographic superiority too deeply held, And throughout the rest of the war, American codebreakers would continue reading Japanese messages, targeting convoys, ambushing fleets, shooting down Yamamoto himself in 1943 after intercepting the details of his inspection tour, turning Japan's own communications network into a weapon of exquisite precision. The Battle of Midway became a case study taught at every naval academy in the world, a perfect example of how intelligence, innovation, and tactical surprise could overcome material superiority, how assumptions about enemy capabilities could be more dangerous than enemy capabilities themselves, how a weapon the enemy cannot possibly possess becomes the most devastating weapon of all because you've built no defense against it. And for Japan, the lesson came too late, paid for in burning carriers and drowning sailors and a naval aviation arm that would never recover its strength. While for America, Midway was the validation of a desperate gamble, proof that Nimitz's trust in his codebreakers was justified, that the endless training in near-vertical dive bombing had been worth the risk, that radar and early warning systems could provide the edge needed in the vast Pacific, and most importantly, that American innovation, the willingness to attempt the impossible, to believe that engineering problems could be solved and tactical doctrines could be rewritten and enemy codes could be broken if you just worked hard enough and smart enough, was itself a weapon more powerful than any battleship. In the months after Midway, as American shipyards began producing carriers at a rate Japan couldn't match, as pilot training programs expanded to replace losses that Japanese training programs couldn't sustain, as codebreakers provided intelligence that let American submarines devastate Japanese supply lines, the strategic balance in the Pacific shifted irreversibly, and every subsequent Japanese defeat could trace its lineage back to that morning when Nagumo's carriers burned, when the myth of invincibility died, when Japan's admirals learned that the Americans possessed weapons they thought were impossible. Not just dive bombers that could strike like lightning or radar that could see beyond the horizon, but the most dangerous weapon of all. The ability to read your enemy's mind through his own communications and then strike with perfect precision at his moment of maximum vulnerability. The surviving Japanese pilots who made it back to Japan, who had watched their carriers die, who had seen the impossible American dive bombers falling from the sky like the hand of an angry god. These men tried to warn their superiors that the Americans were different than they'd been told, that something fundamental had changed, that the enemy possessed capabilities beyond what intelligence had predicted, but their warnings were dismissed as the traumatized ravings of defeated men. Because to accept what they were saying meant accepting that Japan's entire strategic calculation was wrong, that their codes were broken, that their tactics were obsolete, that their enemy was innovating faster than they could respond, and such acceptance was psychologically impossible for a military culture built on certainty and hierarchy and the belief that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans, meanwhile, kept their greatest secret with a discipline that was itself impressive. The code-breaking operation remained so classified that even decades after the war, many veterans died never knowing that their victories had been guided by cryptanalysts who could read enemy messages, never understanding that what seemed like luck or intuition was actually the product of brilliant minds in basement rooms extracting meaning from encrypted chaos, and this security was itself a weapon because it meant Japan never definitively confirmed their codes were broken, never completely changed their communication procedures, never fully understood why American forces kept appearing at exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time with exactly the right force to inflict maximum damage. The legacy of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It validated the entire American approach to warfare, the integration of intelligence and operations, the investment in technology and training, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, the culture that rewarded innovation rather than punishing deviation from doctrine. And in the decades that followed, as America built the intelligence and technological apparatus that would eventually win the Cold War, the lessons of Midway remained central. That information is a weapon, that assumptions about enemy limitations are dangerous, that the impossible should be attempted because sometimes it works, and that the side which can turn theoretical capability into operational reality faster than the enemy can adjust his assumptions will dominate the battlefield regardless of material balance. For Japan, Midway marked the beginning of a long, grinding retreat across the Pacific, a series of increasingly desperate defensive battles fought by forces that grew weaker while their enemy grew stronger. And in the final months of the war, as American B-29s burned Japanese cities and atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were old admirals who remembered that perfect morning in June 1942 when they had believed victory was inevitable, when their carriers had ruled the Pacific, when their codes were unbreakable and their pilots invincible, and they understood that the end had begun that day, that the moment the Americans demonstrated capabilities Japan thought impossible was the moment Japan lost the war, because a nation that cannot imagine what its enemy might achieve is a nation that cannot defend against what its enemy will achieve, and the weapon you believe is impossible is the weapon that kills you, appearing without warning from a direction you never thought to watch, striking with a precision you calculated couldn't exist, turning confidence into catastrophe in the span of 6 minutes that changed the course of history and proved that in war, as in all human endeavors, the greatest danger comes not from the threats you can see but from the capabilities you've convinced yourself cannot possibly exist.